In this video I want to talk about a few tips on how to encourage your Discus and Altum angelfish to spawn. So I will only talk about spawning. I will not talk about raising fry or hatching eggs because these are different topics. I will also talk mostly about Discus and Altums because they have very similar spawning dynamics or spawning patterns. When it comes to regular angelfish, they will spawn more or less readily when you have a mated pair or you have a compatible pair. But in case of Discus and Altums, it's a bit trickier and it's a bit harder to encourage them to spawn, and this is what I will be talking about in this video. So to start with, I'm not exactly a breeder, but I've previously bred Discus, both captive bred and wild Discus. And so the first point to start with when you want to breed your Discus or Altums is to have a compatible pair. When I talk about compatible pair, you need to make sure that you actually have a pair that has a male and female, because if you've never bred Discus or angelfish in general, you may not know that in this fish two females can actually pair up, lay eggs, and clearly these eggs will be infertile because they won't be able to fertilize them, so these eggs will get rotten within a couple of days. But nevertheless, if there are no males ready to breed in your fish tank, even if there are males in your fish tank but they're not ready to breed, very often two females will pair up and they will lay eggs. This is what we can call incompatible pair, because although they look like a pair, they will lay eggs, they will behave like a pair, but they're not a real pair because they're two females, and no matter how hard you will try to spawn them, nothing will come out of it. So how would you distinguish whether you have a compatible pair that consists of a male and female, or you have two females attempting to breed, attempting to spawn? In case when there are two females trying to breed, they will also display some courtship behavior. There will be some fin flaring, there will be some typical breeding behavior that you will normally observe in a pair. But when you have two females, they will fight more often than when you have a pair. So two females will have quite a lot of conflicts. At least this is what I have observed both in Discus and in Altum angels. So when you have a compatible pair, it's not very likely that they will fight each other. They might have some disagreements, but there won't be like daily or hourly fighting between them. So that's one of the signs to look for when you have a compatible pair. So that's a pair that is more likely harmoniously, and they have more interest in each other as compared to two females, because two females, they will stick together but they will still have lots of conflicts. So let's imagine that you have a compatible pair, you have a male and female, they have previously laid eggs and maybe successfully, and that's why you know that you have a pair, because those eggs have hatched and you've seen the larvae, so you know that this pair can breed, and now you want to encourage them to breed again. Sometimes a pair will breed without any encouragement. They will just keep on laying eggs and laying eggs, but quite frequently they will need a bit of encouragement to actually start spawning. And there are three important tips that I would like to focus on. The third one probably would be the most important. So the first issue to look for is food. What will encourage your pair to spawn is a diverse and protein-rich diet, which will be different from what they usually get in their normal lives. So if you try to change and enrich their diets, this can be as a stimulus, as this can be as some sort of an impetus for them to start breeding. In most cases, when you plan to breed Discus or Altums, you would probably want to move them to a separate breeding setup, because if you try to breed them in your community tank, yes, you can try to remove the breeding cone. When in case of Altum angels, you can remove breeding cone with eggs into a separate incubator breeding tank. In case of Discus, you can't really do that, because the parents need to be with their fry in order to provide food for them, because the fry will feed off the parents' mucus for a certain period of time. That's why you need to keep fry with parents. So normally you would want to remove your breeding pair to a separate tank. The question is, when do you start power feeding your pair? Before you move them to the tank or after? Quite a lot of people actually start power feeding their pairs once they are in a breeding setup. This can be a bit of a challenge, because once you put your pair, especially if it happens first time, in a different tank, once you remove them from your community tank and you put them into a breeding tank, this would be a bit of a shock for them, especially if they have never been in that tank before. New environment, smaller tank, everything is different, probably location of the tank is different, so they might be a bit stressed up in the beginning, and they may not have as much appetite as you would expect them to have normally, so they may not feed as much as you would like them to feed, and they will not gain this breeding condition. They will not be in the perfect breeding form. So what I have observed, that it makes a lot of sense to start power feeding your pair while they're still in their community tank, while they're still not in their own breeding tank, and they're in the environment that they're used to. So they will feed comfortably. That can be when they are among other fish, and that's how they will gain weight, and they will get into this breeding condition before you will put them in their breeding tank. So that should work quite well. So once they are in a breeding condition, once you see that they're actually trying to spawn in your community tank, that's when you move them into a separate breeding tank, and they're already well fed and they're already ready to breed. So tip number 1 is fresh water. Adding some volumes of fresh water to your breeding setup will actually encourage spawning, and this is very natural for both discus and angelfish, because they usually spawn the rainy season in their natural habitats. That's when their different waters are mixing, and the water parameters, water chemistry is changing, and this is basically what encourages them to breed. So it's not necessarily the addition of fresh water, but it's addition of a different water that's different from the water in their current setup that encourages them to breed. Some people prefer to do massive water changes, like 80 or 90% water changes in a breeding setup. I don't really recommend that, because both discus, especially wild discus or Altum angels, they're quite sensitive to changes in water parameters, and if you add too much of fresh or new water that has different pH or different other water parameters, they might get a bit stressed out, and they may not be particularly interested in breeding because of this constant changes in water parameters. So it's best to keep water parameters stable by adding just about 20% of new water every day, which will be already sufficient to act as a trigger for them to start spawning. So the third and the most important point is temperature, and you really need to get the temperature right if you want to encourage your discus or altums to spawn. Quite a lot of beginner breeders believe that they need to lower the temperature, which will kind of serve as a trigger for your fish to spawn. And that's correct in case of, for example, tetras or corridoras or other small fish that live in the Amazon region, because when the rainy season starts and when this enormous amount of rain hits the water surface, the water parameters start to change, and particularly the temperature will go down, and this is something that will serve as a trigger for cardinal tetras, neon tetras, lots of small carotines and corridor species to actually try breeding. So you would expect that the similar strategy will work with discus or with altums or with other angelfish, that they will actually enjoy this addition of cooler water, which will be a trigger for them to start spawning. But it's actually the opposite. Yes, I know that's quite unexpected, but when the rainy season starts and when there is a lot of rain hitting the water in discus and altum fish habitats, their temperatures actually go up, because they don't live in shallow areas like small tetras or corridoras. For example, most corridoras live in waters that deep, and also neon tetras live in waters like 1 or 2 feet deep. That's when the temperature can really go down because of addition of rainwater. In case of discus and angelfish, they live in deeper waters as deep as 3 or 5 meters. On such depths, the water temperature doesn't get colder, but it actually gets warmer, because while there is rain, there is lots of sun at the same time, and sun heats up the water surface, and it heats up the lower levels of water much faster than rain actually cools it down. So that's a strange process to describe, but that's what it is. So the temperature during the rainy season in discus and altum fish and angelfish habitats, it actually goes up. So when you want to imitate these conditions, you need to go for higher temperatures in your breeding setups. And by higher, I mean at least 30 or 31 degrees Celsius, or possibly even higher. So first time I read about these processes in Bernd Dagen's book on wild discus. That's actually quite an old book, but it's very useful if you keep discus, especially wild discus. And I found he talks about this dynamics on page 43. So he actually says that the temperature in discus habitats goes up to 34 degrees Celsius, and this is what he recommends to imitate when you want to encourage your discus to spawn. The same thing happens in altum angelfish habitats. The temperatures also go up to a similar level, to 30 something degrees Celsius, and that's what, according to Dagen, this is what also creates perfect conditions for all sort of a fry food, for infusoria, for bacteria to multiply, and that's why there is more food for discus fry and angelfish fry at these higher temperatures. So higher temperature is something that signals to your fish that they should start spawning. Also, you probably know that at higher temperatures there is a higher metabolism, so discus are more active, they eat more eagerly, they just swim more actively, and clearly spawning is one of those behaviors that is triggered by higher temperatures. So to summarize, power feeding, frequent smaller water changes in a breeding setup, and most importantly, correct high temperature. This is what will encourage your discus, including wild discus, but also domestic strains of discus and altum angelfish, as well as most other types of angelfish, to spawn. And this should work all the time. So in order, after you spawn your fish and you want to breed them again, you can lower the temperature, you can decrease the amount of food you feed, you can reduce the number of water changes, and after a while, I would give them about like 3 or 4 weeks rest after each spawn. So after this 3 weeks rest, you start doing the same thing. You power feed them, you increase the number of small but consistent water changes, and you raise the temperature really high. So that will serve as a signal for them every time to start spawning. And over time, your breeding pair, they will figure out, they will have this natural sense that this is a time when they actually have to spawn. So they will just follow this routine over and over again. So good luck with your breeding projects. I hope you find this video useful. If you do, click subscribe and click like button, and I'll see you soon.